Joining us now is Ian Hartitz, fantasy football writer for Fantasy Life. What's up, Ian?
What's going on, fellas? Happy fantasy draft season.
Oh, I know. It's here.
Everybody's fired up for fantasy. I actually have a college fantasy league starting at 10 a.m., the draft.
Today, yeah. I had
one.
one.
Of those rolling drafts.
I had one last weekend.
Those get savage, man. You think you know college football until you get into about round 5 or so and start seeing a bunch of guys you've never heard of.
Yeah. Well, in college fantasy, you just got to be very aware and alert each week of what guys are doing because, it's not like the NFL where when a guy gets hurt. I mean, they're going to flash an injury caveat on the TV. Hey, this guy's hurt. He's banged out. He's going to be out weeks 3, 4, 5. But in college, you got to stay on top of that. You know what I mean?
100%. There's even one league called Campus to Canton where you literally go all the way from. I'm not breaking news to you, but that's where the real sickos are at. But I appreciate all forms of fantasy. We're all just having fun either way.
I think we've got a few of those sickos here. Campus to Canton sickos. So we wanted to talk to you about Cliff Kingsbury's offense because you have some interesting notes about Kingsbury. People here are excited. Kind of the perception is he's this offensive wizard. What should Commanders fans expect from the offense this year, led by Cliff Kingsbury as the offensive coordinator?
Yeah, so opening caveat whenever I mention any of these stats, yes, guys, I understand this is just the preseason. It's not going to exactly be what we see here in a couple short weeks, but you know what? It's the best we're working with right now. So I do think when we can find, again, more extreme trends at either end of the spectrum, maybe that can help lead us onto something. And just in terms of what we've seen through these first 8 quarters with the Commanders, this really does look pretty similar to exactly what Kingsbury was doing in Arizona. Whether it's looking at Terry McLaurin's alignment, I mean, literally just being out there as the offense is left outside wide receiver for 28 of his 29 snaps. Saw the exact same phenomenon with DeAndre Hopkins. This is also a situation where we have a 56% no huddle rate right now, second highest team in the preseason. That's just 13%. That's another similarity we saw from Arizona. Dead last in pre-snap shift motion rate, 31st in play action rate, just a lot of things that, again, we saw plenty of the time in Arizona. And not to come out here and say that those Arizona offenses were all terrible, but, it has been a while since I think Kingsbury has kind of lived up to that offensive mastermind, sort of reputation. Overall, from 2019 to 2022, those Cardinals offenses were 16th, 13th, 11th, and 21st in total points scored. So don't think he was exactly, cooking with gas in terms of the personnel they had in Arizona. But then again, in Washington, outside of Jayden and obviously Terry McLaurin, don't exactly think this is the world's best offensive environment ever. So we'll see what happens. But so far, it really has been a bit too, for my liking at least, a bit too similar to some of those collegiate spread offenses, really stationary pre-snap than maybe we would have preferred.
Just to kind of defend Kingsbury before we get into some other stuff, and I did this a couple segments ago. When he was in Arizona, all right, Kyler Murray was a rookie his first year. They had a bad year. He took 50 sacks, but he did finish 9th in the league in pass attempts. The second year, the team got better. They went 8-8. The offense got better. He was 7th in pass attempts. Third year, his best year, they went to the playoffs. He was 19th in pass attempts, but James Conner came in, and he was the running back as opposed to Kenyon Drake. So he leaned on James Conner a little bit more, so it was more of a balance. And then that fourth year, when you mentioned that the points per game went down, Kyler got hurt that year, even though they weren't very good even when he was playing. But I think they got better his first 3 years, and especially points per game. It went from 22 to 26, almost 27. So the offense did get better under Kingsbury in those first 3 years.
For sure, and I think, a big point is that no huddle rate, that ability to play with a fast pace. And you said it yourself, man, like Kyler and even James Conner put up some big-time numbers because of that. When we're creating more plays in a game, it is shrinking the variance, and that should allow some of your better players to go out there and get more opportunities to make plays. But, is that really what we want to do this year for the 2024 Washington Commanders? Do we want to be in these constant track meets? Because I don't know about you guys, but I saw what that defense looked like down the stretch of last year. I mean, it's not like they were really covering anybody in the first half. And then, yeah, guess what? You take away your two best pass rushers and things get that much worse. So, look, this just, to me, seems like more of the mindset that you want to see from an offense in college when you have someone like Patrick Mahomes, like Kingsbury obviously did at Texas Tech, or if you're playing, with the Kansas City Chiefs or Buffalo Bills right now, having all those plays in the game, we love that in fantasy land. We'll take as many opportunities with the football as we can get. But for real life purposes, just not so sure I'm the highest on what Cliff is bringing to the table right now.
All right.
I think you referenced Josh Norris's numbers about Jayden Daniels specifically on his 15 dropbacks. And two of the things that he had noted was he's getting rid of the ball in less than 2 seconds. The quickest in the NFL last season was 2.36 seconds. And his air yards per attempt so far has been below last season's shortest in the NFL at 5.5 yards. What have you seen from Jayden? Running is different, but in terms of the passing game.
Yeah, he certainly made some nice throws. That opening pearl down the right sideline to Diane Brown, you can put that up there with really anything we've seen in the preseason. But then again, Jayden said himself that he actually had the audible to that play to make it happen in the first place. So, look, I think if anyone watched Jayden Daniels at LSU, we saw plenty of deep dives down the sideline to guys like Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. time and time again. And we also saw the speed that helped the dude win the freaking Heisman Trophy, for crying out loud. But we also haven't quite seen Daniels, admittedly have to do some of the tougher things that he was being criticized for, i.e. throwing the ball a bit more over the middle and just dealing with pressure. Last season at LSU, only 48% of Daniels' pressure dropbacks actually ended up resulting in a pass attempt. That was the fourth lowest mark among 147 qualified quarterbacks. So, again, watching the film, to me, it wasn't ever a situation of Daniels not necessarily getting through his progressions. I think he's very good at that. But you would see plenty of examples that the rare occasions when pressure would come, it seemed like Daniels would kind of drop his eyes and just revert into a runner. And guess what? When you're as fast as he is, and especially when you're playing college defenses, it worked out more times than not for him. But at the NFL level, things are going to be a bit more tight. So I was kind of laughing at that scramble he had last week, gains like 12 yards, and you saw Dan Quinn telling him, get down, and Daniels kind of acknowledging it as well. Man, if that sort of play was already getting Dan Quinn nervous, man, I'm worried to see what's going to happen once Daniels starts again, reverting to a bit more of that reckless man in the open field we've seen. You mentioned the Josh Norris stats, but love the comp that actually Nate Tice of Yahoo Sports had for Jayden Daniels coming out, basically saying that when he's in the open field, got a bit of Johnny Knoxville to his game in terms of the hits he's taken. So
true.
Stay healthy, get down, Jayden. But, yeah, for right now, again, he's played fine in the preseason, but I don't think it's been anything that we necessarily weren't expecting coming in.
So just from a fantasy standpoint, what are you looking at from Washington offensively? Where do you like McLaurin? Where do you rank him? Is he like a legit number 2 receiver? Do you like him a little bit below that just based on the numbers? Or is he like a legit number 2? And then with Jayden, FanDuel has his total passing touchdowns set at 16.5. Do you like the over there if he stays healthy? And then where do you like Jayden in fantasy, especially in a super flex?
16.5 seems a little low. I'll take the slide over, but at the same time, not exactly expecting, 30, 35 passing scores out of him this year. But you know what? In fantasy football, the two archetypes that we continuously see kind of bust the game and, dictate differently relative to what we're seeing in real life are rushing quarterbacks and then high volume receiving running backs who maybe we'll see Austin Eckler, resume having that role. But again, we just don't see quarterbacks who run as much as Jayden really bust in fantasy land. 27 quarterbacks have had at least 100 carries in a season over the past 10 years. All but 3 of them went on to finish as a top 12 fantasy quarterback. 41% of those guys were even top 3. So, guys, Tim Tebow and Taysom Hill, probably the 2 worst passers that we have seen in the modern NFL, they were still putting up top 8 fantasy numbers just by virtue of, again, running the ball more times than not when they drop back to pass. So, Jayden Daniels, even if, we can't quite get him up into that QB6, QB7, QB8 tier with guys like Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, and Jordan Love, Dak Prescott, I do think he is right behind them, certified top 10 quarterback, where if you get into round 9 or 10 of your 1 QB draft, I certainly think he's in play. Superflex, he's going to be more so again, probably in those early middle stages of round 2. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys about some of the horror stories you can get into if you really overly fade quarterbacks in the Superflex format. So I have no concerns with, taking Jayden as a round 2 pick because, again, even if the real life struggles could be there early on, I think his archetype and just playing style is going to fit in just fine in fantasy land. As for Terry McLaurin, really hoping we see him finally, break out of this wide receiver 3 sort of fantasy, not slump he's been in. He's obviously a great player, but man, when you just talk about this generation's Andre Johnson or Allen Robinson just stuck with one bad quarterback after another, I mean, it's tough to say Terry McLaurin and DJ Moore aren't really topping that list. So, hey, as much as I mentioned the DeAndre Hopkins, esque alignment for Terry, Hopkins had over 1,400 yards during his lone full season in Arizona with 160 targets. So if he is going to be featured as Kingsbury's clear-cut number 1 wide receiver, which would make sense to me, especially considering the lack of kind of a proven guy behind him, with all due respect to Dawson, I do think that Terry is going to have an opportunity to really rise above where he's being drafted right now. So currently a guy that you can see wide receiver 31, wide receiver 32 in ADP on more sites than not. I think guys like Terry McLaurin and Amari Cooper going in that range as well really stand out as ballers who, have a few questions with their overall offensive environment, but just like it's tough for rushing quarterbacks to bust, tough for a wide receiver that could see 150-plus targets be too bad in fantasy as well.
Talking to Ian Hartitz, fantasy football writer for Fantasy Life. I'm intrigued to hear where you have Anthony Richardson, because you're talking about cheat codes and the little amount of play he had last year. He looked like he was going to be a fantasy superstar. Coming off an injury, missed a ton of games last year. How do you see him? Where's he ranked amongst your quarterbacks?
You're not kidding, man. I mean, 2 full games, he had 20.9 and 29.6 fantasy points. And even in that week 2 contest against the Texans, 17.7 fantasy points on just 18 snaps. I mean, this dude was number 1 in fantasy points per dropback last year for a reason. So one of my most drafted quarterbacks of the offseason. I mean, I know it might sound weird to have Anthony Richardson already ranked inside the top 6 when we've only seen him play, a handful of games at the professional level. But again, this sort of archetype just doesn't really bust in fantasy land. So yes, you're spot on, man. Anthony Richardson and Jayden Daniels, really 2 guys I think everyone in traditional leagues, 4-point passing touchdowns, should be making a habit of grabbing. So if I am going to be spending up on a quarterback, I want them to have that ability to break fantasy football, the Jalen Hurts and Josh Allens of the world. And really, I do think that goal line rushing role is what could separate Richardson from guys like Daniels and even Lamar Jackson, because his head coach, obviously Shane Steichen, was making things happen with Jalen Hurts in that Eagles offense, and, arguably deserves a lot of credit for popularizing the, tush push as it began. So that is the difference, I think, between someone like Richardson and Kyler and even Jayden Daniels, where last year, in terms of quarterback rush attempts inside the 5-yard line, there's Jalen Hurts, number 1 at 16, Josh Allen, number 2 at 14, and then no other quarterback had more than 5. So I do think Richardson, even if they're going to, protect his health, I mean, we heard Shane Steichen say it, where he wouldn't, be asking Steph Curry to shoot fewer 3-pointers, so he's not going to be taking the foot off the gas with Richardson's rushing work just yet either. So maybe a bit of a lofty comparison for a guy with, 4 career NFL starts to his name, but, God only makes so many humans that are 6'4", 255 and can run a 4.4. So Richardson, just like Daniels, even if we see, some normal growing pains as a real-life passer, just think he runs more than enough to still make it work in fantasy land.
All right, so in terms of receivers, where do you have – I assume you have Justin Jefferson as a first-rounder, but do you expect his numbers to dip considerably considering what quarterback's throwing to him? Number 1. Number 2, rookie receivers, guys like Harrison Jr., guys like Neighbors, guys like Odunze. Where do you have those guys? And also, speaking of receivers, Ayuk and CD still not in camp. I assume that you still have CD as maybe the number 1 receiver, if not number 2, behind Tyreek. But should fantasy owners kind of be alert on numbers being slow out of the gate because they just haven't been around?
Yeah, so first of all, with Jefferson, it's one of those things where I think people that are even low on him don't have him ranked lower than like wide receiver 5. So we're ultimately debating, should he be like the 5th or 6th player off the board or more like the 7th or 8th. So personally, the only wide receivers I'm taking ahead of him at the moment are the one you named, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, and then Jamar Chase. But man, if we get another week closer to the year and we got Chase and CeeDee still holding, in and out respectively, going to be tough not to push him up a little bit. So yes, we have seen, very mixed results in the past of these wide receivers having, iffy signal callers under center. And even, look no further than the guy we mentioned earlier, DeAndre Hopkins, and what he had to do during that Houston year with Brock Osweiler to see a truly great wide receiver suffer from ineptitude under center. So Jefferson, maybe he is just that much better than every other wide receiver to make things work. But, we saw it last year with Jamar Chase and Jake Browning under center, and even to an extent with Jefferson. I know people love throwing out the Nick Mullins stat and, how Jefferson was on the 2,000 yardage pace during those 4 games without Kirk Cousins. But, unfortunately, the Vikings only get to play the Lions twice per year. So not so sure we can exactly take that pace and extrapolate it to 17 games. So Jefferson's still my wide receiver 4, but I get if people want to take, quote unquote, safer options like Bijan Robinson, like Breece Hall at that spot in the first round. With some of the rookie wide receivers, tough to be too low on Marvin Neighbors, just because not only did they fall into offenses that obviously appreciate their talents, wouldn't have been drafted as top 6 if they didn't, but man, such little target competition for both. I mean, with all due respect to Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison Jr. should be the engine of that Kyler Murray-led offense from the beginning. And Malik Neighbors, there's just even less to worry about there. So just like with Jefferson, not exactly looking at the best quarterback situations in the world. Kyler's certainly better than Darnold and, Daniel Jones and everything. But it really does come down to, okay, with Malik Neighbors, when we're talking about the potential for 150-plus targets, tough to be too low on the guys. So Neighbors for me is my wide receiver 14 right there with guys like Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel, who, yes, they are, in my opinion, at this point in time, better wide receivers and offenses we can trust more. But with enough target competition, I do think Neighbors makes things a lot closer just by the virtue of, again, being such a clear-cut number 1 in New York. And as for CeeDee Lamb, just get it done, Jerry. You've been talking about going all in, all off season. Just sign your best player already because, again, even if I don't have data on it, you guys see it as much as I do. When these guys hold out and they suddenly get signed, they come back in and try to get back up to 100. Just feel like there's a worrying, track record of those guys getting a little bit more banged up early on in the year than we would prefer. But, again, every time we look at any wide receiver in fantasy, we're ultimately zeroing in on 4 factors most of the time. Like, how good is the player? What kind of target competition does he have? Is it an offensive environment that's going to give him a bunch of targets and scoring opportunities? And does he have a good quarterback? And just in terms of those 4 factors, I don't think anyone clears it as well as CeeDee because, again, Dak, even if you don't think he's a top 3 or top 5 quarterback, I think we can all probably safely assume top 10, top 12. Mm-hmm. No target competition in Dallas. He's entering his prime, 25 years young, I believe. And, again, just someone that we have so few question marks about as long as he can get on the football field. So for my money's worth right now, it is still Christian McCaffrey first overall. But, man, if CeeDee Lamb, in the next few hours signs that contract, I even thinking, a 3 wide receiver starting format, full PPR. CeeDee's as good as pick as anyone at the top of the draft.
Great stuff, Ian. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, buddy.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Ian Hartitz, fantasy football writer for Fantasy Life.